He's Andrew Lih, Associate Professor of Journalism at USC, and he's here to moderate the panel called Man Bites Dog. So Andrew Lih.
Thanks. Hi, thanks for everyone being here. I know this is a tough time because we're waiting drinks across the way and you're probably hitting food coma right now. And we're going opposite the humor panel, which is one of the more intimidating things to do. But we're going to try to make it interesting conversation with you folks here. And this is actually being memorialized for a documentary film of some sort after this. So hopefully other folks who are not here can see that as well. So as Jas mentioned, I teach at USC and I also do some TV commentary work for KCET here in Los Angeles. And before that I was based in Asia, where I was writing my book but also doing reporting on China. And I thought one of the things that I ran into all the time was a great story to start things off with. Because as we start to talk about how stereotypes shape the news, it's interesting to see how some of our own experiences that we've been through give us insight into how the news media covers us. So I thought I'd tell you something very briefly, and then we will go down the line and introduce each of the panelists here, and they'll talk briefly about what they kind of see as a critical issue in stereotyping and how news folks and news operations do their job. Then we hope to answer your questions or open it up to your interaction very early on so we can have a dialogue out there. Now, one of the interesting things about being a professor of journalism and a journalist is that I get called on a lot by folks in the news media for commentary on things. When I was based in China, I had a lot of inquiries overseas. I was writing a book about Wikipedia at the time, so I had a lot of inquiries about internet culture and how people collaborated online. And when I was based in Beijing, I noticed that there was a trend that I really didn't pick up on until about a year into really getting a lot of inquiries from reporters. And they would often, not only just ask what they write about the Chinese, say the Chinese think this, but the Chinese think that. The Chinese have moved to block the internet. And it always puzzled me why I felt so uncomfortable with that. And as a Chinese American, I think it was, I considered myself Chinese, but I didn't consider myself that Chinese. And what was interesting is that we start to look at how we report about different ethnicities and different races and different languages and different cultures and religion, you start to realize that as a Chinese, we're at a big disadvantage because we use the same word for ethnicity, for language, for nationality, and for a whole bunch of other things, whereas other cultures have a lot more nuance. So here's a good example. So take, for example, this sentence that would not be unusual to hear in a newspaper. Even though Jews from New York are Jewish and speak Hebrew, they don't always agree with their Israeli counterparts. Pretty straightforward, right? Jews from New York are Jewish and speak Hebrew, they don't always agree with their Israeli counterparts. If you were to use that sentence, or use that same construction for Chinese, it would read like this. Even though Chinese from LA are Chinese and speak Chinese, they don't always agree with their Chinese counterparts. And you realize that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And that's because we project all those things onto one word, which is Chinese, right? So we have Jewish, Hebrew, Semitic, Israeli. These are all distinctions we have for folks who might be an Israeli national, might be Jewish faith, might speak Hebrew, might be of Jewish descent, but we have different words for all those different things. For Chinese, we don't. Now, in the Chinese language, we do, but when we map them to English, we don't. And from there, we start to see a lot of problems, right? So that even for Americans who are conscientious, they cannot make that distinction between a Chinese national, Chinese ethnicity, Chinese language, because we don't give them that chance in the language that we use as either journalists or writers. So that's kind of an interesting thing that always puzzled me as to why I found it so problematic, and I think I put my finger on it. And the question is then, for not just this question, but for the panelists, is when you do recognize a problem like this, where can you make that fix? Or do you have the power or the opportunity to make that fix? Because as journalists and working folks in the news industry, you don't have the last word on these things. You have to work within a newsroom, you work with an editor, you work with other folks. You can't change the standards and the style overnight to reflect all these things. And it's a lot to put on the average reader to try to understand all those things. So that's kind of a conundrum that I don't really know the answer to, but I thought I'd throw it out there as something that I don't see an obvious solution for, but is certainly becoming an issue as we start to see all kinds of coverage of China now as the main foil to the US. And a lot of the great videos we saw here over the course of the day highlight those things, whether they're ads from US political candidates hammering China and Chinese, or whether it's Asaf Mandi there talking about learning Chinese and are you Chinese if you learn Chinese, right? So I thought I'd leave that as kind of my little critical issue, and I thought we could march down the panel and have folks introduce themselves and talk a little bit about how they run into these types of issues while they're reporting, and how we might be able to solve these things. So let's start on my left with Leslie Berestein Rojas from KPCC. Is it right to say KPCC, or do I need to say something? So, please.
Okay, yes, I'm Leslie Berestein Rojas. I'm with KPCC. I write the Multi-American blog. I cover immigration. And you know, it's interesting because you bring to it levels of nuance that don't even get heard in the newsroom usually. You know, one of the things that's typically, it kind of drives me crazy is like, you know, the fill in the blanks community. You know, right? You know, it's the Chinese community. You know, where? You know, where? I think, I mean, one of the things that, you know, most obvious thing to try to do is at least differentiate between, you know, who is an immigrant, who is Chinese American, what language do they speak? Because people, of course, don't speak Chinese. They'll speak Mandarin, they'll speak Cantonese, they'll speak a number of things. I was reminded of doing a story recently on how there were 3 Indian languages added to the ballot and also voter materials last year. And there are dozens of languages spoken in India. So, you know, people just don't speak one. And so it's important to, if you don't know, ask the questions and see if there's a way that you can bring that nuance. And even if there's no one you can ask, just look it up, perhaps. But I'll move on to Henry. Yeah.
Well, already 2 tough acts to follow. I work at the LA Times just up the street. I have a fancy title, assistant managing editor, but kind of a cool, straightforward job. I oversee the copy desks, and I'm also the standards editor. So no sweat, those are easy things, right? But that's a way of saying I think a lot about words. I hope that we're judged by the overall tenor, fairness, thoughtfulness, we hope, of our coverage of immigrants or other people in the community who might have interesting cultural backgrounds. But the words that we choose are also very important, so I think a lot about them. Our readers, our users online, they make me think a lot because they complain quite a bit about the words we use. We're having an internal discussion now about how we describe folks in the United States who may not have full legal status. Our organization chooses a term that differs from the one that Leslie's and Wendy's chooses, but we're having a really good discussion internally about it. Many to ask, are we being precise when we refer to people, say, as illegal immigrant, knowing that the law is changing, people's status is changing? It's a big deal, and we're taking it seriously. Our overall coverage, we think, is very thorough and thoughtful, and yet the words can trip people up and connote something to our audience that we may not intend to do. As the token older person on this panel, I think about all kinds of ways we might inadvertently stereotype or profile folks. So I've been reading our paper more carefully with an eye to how we describe folks my age and older, and it's kind of shocking once my eyes have been opened by some readers as to how we inadvertently, certainly not purposefully, stereotype people based on when they were born. And on. Whether it's gender, religion, sexual orientation, there are all kinds of ways that we, interestingly, it's sort of ironic, we try to humanize our sources by describing them as fully as we can. Here's an interesting person that's part of my story. I'm going to tell you about her and tell you as much as I can in the space and time allotted to tell you her story. And yet, I might, because of the limitations there, inadvertently label someone and therefore connote something that I don't mean to, that the receiver of the message in the form of a story will put his or her own sort of stereotypes on top of the label. So we have to think carefully about how we describe folks. And so by trying to humanize people, tell a lot of things about them, and not ask if those bits of information are really germane, we have the ironic effect of dehumanizing them by putting them under the label of the Chinese or undocumented immigrant or whatever that might connote, or some broader group. And so what I always advocate for in good journalism is precision, and what Leslie was getting to too, which is a good dialogue between the journalist and the source. You have to ask the question, as Leslie suggests, specific questions over and over till you get it right. Internal to our newsrooms, and we represent some really good ones, you have to have a good dialogue between the hunter-gatherer of the information, the reporter and the producer or the editor on the inside. And so I'm happy to see that our reporting staff is fairly diverse. Our editing staff sometimes is not as diverse or as culturally aware as it might be. And so I talk to younger journalists all the time who are trying to train their editors to think differently and not to also in their questioning and their editing inadvertently convey a stereotype. So I'm rambling a little bit, but the idea is that the more we talk about these things, the more we think about these things, we want to deliver smart, thoughtful journalism, but how we do it is so important because the words really do have all kinds of meanings, intended and otherwise, and I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Wendy Lee. I'm a business reporter at 89.3 KPCC, and when I got my first journalism job, my uncle told me that he didn't think I looked like a journalist or a reporter. He actually thought that I looked more like a lawyer. And, you know, I think that with a lot of these labels, like the Chinese or things like that, like I think that, you know, people may have these perceptions about people, and I guess the way that I kind of try to handle that is just to deal with each person at a time. So I think, for example, like with what Andrew was saying about the label of the Chinese, I think that one way that reporters can deal with that is having good, thoughtful discussions with their editors. I'm really glad that the workplace I work in now really values diversity. We have a lot of different people that, you know, really make it a point to go out into the communities, to talk to many different people, to be reflective of the different voices of Southern California. But, you know, in the past, I've had editors that have asked me, you know, why does the term Asian American exist? Why don't we just say Chinese? Or why don't we just call that person Vietnamese? Why do we have to say Vietnamese American? And, you know, I had a very long discussion with my editor on it, and, you know, hopefully, you know, with conversations like that, you'll educate people and, you know, give them more understanding to some of these nuances.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mei Fong, and I feel like a bit of a fraud at being on this panel because, first of all, I'm not Asian American. I was actually born in Malaysia, and I spent most of my life there growing up. Neither do I cover Asian American topics because actually I spent most of my working life covering Asia for the Wall Street Journal. However, I am Asian and I did work for an American newspaper, so I guess there are certain nuances there that I think are important to talk about. And I'll start first with talking about, anyone read anything about this guy called Joe Brinkley? He's a professor up at Stanford, and he wrote something about how fairly recently there are no dogs, apparently very few dogs left in Vietnam because everybody just eats them all up, eat all the wildlife up. And, you know, you read something and you think, wow, that must have been written like 50 years ago. No, it wasn't. It was written this year. And what I have to say kind of goes towards that because what I found when I was covering my years of covering Asia that was both an impediment and also an asset at the time was being an Asian face writing for a global, or rather American news organization in Asia, which has both its assets and disadvantages. Because what I had to contend with or deal with was this kind of thing that Joel Brinkley sort of represented, the authority of the white male correspondent in Asia. And so, I mean, when you think about, for example, your foreign correspondent image, what do you think of? Someone wearing a safari jacket, a man, right? A white man. You know, you think of The Killing Fields, who was it? Who is Sidney Schanberg, right? New York Times, white guy. Who was the Asian guy with him? Dick Prant. He was the second banana. So, so that was always the issue I had. The problem, there's this club in Hong Kong called the Foreign Correspondents Club. Anyone been there? It's called the FCC. It's where the foreign correspondents supposedly go. I hate going to that Foreign Correspondents Club because mostly almost everyone there is white, and most of the local staff are people behind the bar. So if I ever ended up there, the assumption was always I was the girlfriend of the foreign correspondent, who was, of course, going to be a white male. So this was an issue that I had to, and it isn't just applying to, it would be like, for example, if I went to interview Wang Qishan, who was the mayor of Beijing at that time, and now he's a very senior member of China's Politburo. And it wasn't just me, I was there with my deputy editor, and we shook hands, and he shook my editor's hand very nicely, and when it came to me, he sort of, because he thought I was the translator, because he saw an Asian female, and he thought maybe I was, going to be the secretary, not the one interviewing him. And so my point here is, you need more Asian Americans covering Asia, because there are certain assets and advantages to it. You get more diverse opinions. You stop getting all these kind of stupid stories about people eating dogs only, and you get more nuances. And also, I think you get, there's certain stories that blending in is very important, So even though my Chinese is pretty crap, I got into certain situations or stories where I could report better because I didn't stick out like a sore thumb. I could go to a village. I could go. There was a story in 2008 when they had the Sichuan earthquake, and so this was China's worst earthquake in 30 years. It killed lots of people, more people than it was killed in Hiroshima, and when I was thinking of how to do the story, I thought one of the ways to do it would be to write a story about Sichuan migrant workers going back to their earthquake towns, and and write about the journey process, about what it was like to go back and hike and walk for days, and I could do that because I didn't stick out, and I could evade all the official checkpoints and bear points in a way that I wouldn't if I was if I didn't blend in. So I would say that, I would make a point that it is really quite necessary to have more Asian Americans come. And I'm surprised that I don't find that many of them, as much as you'd think. And the second point I would make here would be, when you are ethnically the same, when you have the same ethnicity as the place you're covering, but not necessarily the same nationality, that does create certain issues. For example, because I'm ethnically Chinese, but I'm not nationally Chinese, sometimes the Chinese people would expect you to write stories that were favorable to Chinese. So I would get the kind of comments that my other colleagues who were not ethnically Chinese, especially if you wrote stories that seemed to be critical of China, they would say, "How dare you do this?" Because their onus was that somehow, because your ethnicity is the same as theirs, you would be expected to write much more positive stories. In 2008, we wrote about the torch relay that was happening around the world in the Olympics, and China was getting huge criticism because of their treatment of Tibet. So all throughout the torch relay to Paris and places like that, you saw footage of people sort of jumping on the torch runner. There was a very famous case in Paris. The torch bearer was a Chinese girl, and she was in a wheelchair, and she was jumped on by a human rights protester in Paris. And in the rest of the world, they were saw it, well, people are, protesting against China's human rights record. In China, they saw it as, well, this the world against us. And anytime I wrote stories like that, I would get a lot of blowback from Chinese people saying, you're very disloyal. How dare you present this well? You're such a traitor. You're a dog, running dog, and all that sort of thing, which you don't get if I wasn't ethnically Chinese. So I guess these are 2 points. They're not necessarily manifestos out here that I want to raise that I think would be interesting for anyone who's contemplating covering Asia or is ever reading any coverage about Asia. Thank you.
She made some really good points, though. I mean, just in terms of having worked in Mexico, it's the foreign correspondent. There is this thing about who's coming in and doing it right. And it is very important to get people who at least understand the culture and the language. Not just, how can I even put this? There are some wonderful reporters who have learned a language and immersed themselves in a culture and do a really good job at what they do. But I just think there's really something to be said, whether it's somebody who's covering, Asia, who's covering Latin America, who's actually covering, immigrant communities here in the United States. There's really something to be said for having people who are, ethnically and culturally part of who it is that they're covering. It's extremely important. It's great to have that nuance and great to have that perspective.
I wonder if I can add just a quick, possibly positive data point. I'm here in part as a representative of the Asian American Journalists Association. Our Asia chapter, and our president can nod in agreement, I hope, if I'm right, I believe is the fastest growing chapter of the 20 chapters around the world. Once was maybe 3 or 4 people and is now of a size that rivals that of some of the bigger chapters, including ours in LA. So they're not all on camera or on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, but they are there. It's fairly recent development, and I think it's a positive sign that something is changing in the way that the folks who make the hiring decisions are thinking about this and maybe getting the message.
Oh, you're right, and I'm really heartened by that. When I heard that the Asian chapter was the fastest growing, I was like, wow, hooray, because I remember when we were out there and the AJ chapter felt like, because comprised of like 5 people. I felt like there was Ken, who was in India, there was Yukari, who was in Japan, and there was me. And so it felt like we were really far apart. And, you know, we did try to be very supportive of Asian American journalists who came out on reporting gigs, and we tried to give them, you know, the information, advice, you know, suggestions for translators and all. And I think that is a really important resource to develop, because the other thing is, you know, news bureaus are increasingly cutting back on costs. So, you know, the cost of setting up a foreign bureau overseas is very, very expensive. So increasingly, we're not going to see that. What we're going to see is parachute journalism. You'll send a reporter out there for a short assignment or 2, but you can't afford to place someone there full time. And so it's very important for us to maintain that development of that network, so that you have people who are local on the ground who are willing to help you with that, because certain areas like North Korea, China, or so on, if you don't get the right translator, you don't get the right fixer, then you're going to end up with a situation, what happened in current TV, where the 2 reporters were helped by the North Korean. Yeah.
Since the title of this panel was Man Bites Dog, Jeff Yang is particularly proud of that title. So we should at least acknowledge some of the things that we were assembled here to talk about. And as you mentioned before, and how many people here heard of the Joel Brinkley piece about Vietnam before you came here? So a lot of you did, right? It was pretty astounding, considering he was a Pulitzer Prize winner for reporting on Cambodia. It was just such an amazing thing that someone who seems to know that region, or is, I don't even want to say sensitive, but knowledgeable about that region, could write something that seems like from yesteryear. And then Wendy suggested we share something from WCCO, right? Is that
Yeah.
right? Which is an interesting case that maybe not everyone has heard of before in terms of the resolution, because it took place over a period of time to uncover the story, right? So should I just play this piece? Yeah. Okay.
Or midnight. The owner of Minnesota's largest dog breeding operation still sold hundreds of puppies illegally, despite being convicted of animal cruelty.
That is what the I-Team just discovered, and when we kept digging, things got more disturbing. We went undercover in New York City to see the Canine Culture Center for ourselves, but found a meat market at the same address. And as the I-Team's James Shugel learned, a worker there says he only sells dogs to eat.
Dogs walking in their own feces and the smell of urine throughout the building. That's what an investigator with Companion Animal Protection Society found during an undercover visit to this Long Island, New York pet store.
I've been in business like 40 years. I look at the dogs online. They come with veterinary checks.
The pet store's owner told CAP's president, Deb Howard, his pups are privately and family bred.
Where do you get your dogs from?
4 different breeders, and I'm randomly inspected by the state. No puppy mills.
But that's exactly what the I-Team discovered. He has gotten nearly 600 dogs. Federal and state documents say the supplier is Kathy Bach, accused of running the largest puppy mill in Minnesota. Bach was convicted of animal cruelty and torture 2 years ago. In 2008, an undercover CAPS agent recorded Bach dunking some dogs in insecticide. The U.S. Department of Agriculture said it caused the animals trauma, behavioral stress, or discomfort. Bach pleaded guilty to practicing veterinary medicine without a license. The USDA determined she was unfit to provide humane care and treatment of her animals and terminated her license temporarily for 2 years.
He's a good boy.
But the USDA did not take away Bach's dogs. She's selling wholesale, despite that court order telling her not to.
We were only going in for one. We ended up with two because they were the most pathetic.
Julianne Furrow and Keith Mashi bought 2 pups from that Long Island pet store last spring. One's face is crooked. Both have parasites and show aggression.
How much have you spent on vet bills?
Probably around $2,000.
The couple researched the dogs they bought and found they came from Kathy Bach. One was at the pet store 2 months, the other 5. But it's not clear when the problems with their pets started.
The dogs that were there when we bought these 2, and they looked worse. And I had to get out of there. I couldn't stand looking at them. It was pathetic. It was terrible.
The I-Team found Kathy Bach's dogs ended up in pet stores across New York City and Long Island. The I-Team obtained Minnesota certificates of veterinary inspection. Foreign veterinarians sign once they've inspected animals that will be shipped to another state. Between August of 2010 and August of this year, Bach shipped and sold nearly 1,400 dogs to pet stores in a half dozen New York cities. And she did this without that USDA breeder's license that she needed to legally sell and ship wholesale. The biggest surprise for the I-Team came while looking for the Canine Culture Center. It's listed on those veterinary inspection certificates as 36 East Broadway in New York City. We just happened to stumble upon the Dachshund Meat Market at the same address.
I'm looking for the Canine Culture Center at the Catherine Pet Shop. Do you know anything about it?
State inspection certificates show Bach sold and shipped nearly 170 dogs, mostly Huskies, to this address. And that's where we found the Chinatown Meat Market. We searched both levels of the building.
Canine Culture Center? No. This is a law thing.
But we found no sign of dogs. Until we called the market directly.
Do you sell dogs?
The man told us, yeah, we sell dog, so we questioned him more. Dogs for people to eat? Yeah, he said. We sell many kinds of meat.
Dogs for people to eat?
We questioned the man again, just to be clear. He told us he does not sell dogs for pets. He only sells them for food.
Hi, Kathy. Hi, James Shugel with WCC.
The I-Team confronted Kathy Bach about all this, but she firmly denied she shipped dogs to the meat market. I never sold a dog for anyone to eat them. Trust me, never. She said the person she shipped to must have given her the wrong address, even though there were a dozen shipments to that address. Bach's veterinarian Dr. Kathleen Markison also told the I-Team she knew nothing about shipments to a meat market.
In the conversation I had with Dr. Markison, she said that she has never been to Kathy Bach's farm. In fact, she went on to tell me that Kathy Bach always brought her dogs here to the veterinary clinic in Staples to be examined before they were shipped.
Wendy, you want to give us an update on what happened?
Sure. So when the story aired, prior to working at KPCC, I used to work in Minnesota. I worked at the Star Tribune, different from WCCO, the news organization that aired this piece. But basically, when the guy called the restaurant and asked, "Do you sell dog?" the guy didn't actually respond, "I sell dog." He said, "I sell duck." But they didn't, I guess that he didn't catch the accent when the guy said it. And so it actually prompted a state health inspection on this restaurant. And, well, they didn't find dog at the restaurant. And actually, AAJA, Asian American Journalists Association, played a really big role in really confronting WCCO about this story. And eventually, the station did acknowledge that the guy on the phone at the Chinese business said, "Duck, not dog." But, I think that the story illustrates that, it wasn't just the reporter that, made the mistake, but there were a lot of people that looked at the story before it aired. And, I think that there were a lot of questions that weren't asked before it aired.
Yeah. And it's, this is a classic case of confirmation bias, right? If you already have this kind of dreaded answer that where it's going to get eyeballs, you're just that much more attracted to make that story, follow that narrative, right? So it's just fascinating, and I don't know. I mean, I look to the audience for some ideas. Even it's just such an easy, cheap joke, and even folks that are fairly progressive, like Bill Maher, and still just throwing those Korean dog jokes left and right. It's just really low-hanging fruit for comedians or anyone to to just make that the butt of all jokes. So I don't know what the solution is other than, you know, there is truth that they do sell dog meat in certain places in southern China, but it's certainly not a staple anywhere, right? And that's something that is really tough to try to figure out where that balance is in reporting something like that.
I remember reading the story once talking about when Disney was going to open their first theme park in China. And a writer, whose name I've since forgotten, said something like, well, this will never work. First of all, the Chinese don't like to stand in line for anything, so they'll never stand in line for, you know, all these rides. And secondly, you know, how are the Chinese going to look at Donald Duck? They're just going to want to eat Donald Duck. And I thought, well, that was stupid, but that was kind of funny in a way. But maybe can I just make a contrarian point here? And let me preface this by saying that I'm an owner of a dog that I found in Beijing. I love dogs very much, yeah. But there's nothing wrong with eating dog in a cultural sense if you're from a very poor country and there's not a whole lot of things on the plate to eat. So we got to remember our cultural biases here too. Yeah, you know, in the same way, yes, we love dogs because we have very deep cultural involvement in America, but other parts of the world don't necessarily have the same attachment to that particular. They may like something else better, you know. So, you know, I've seen villages in China where they serve you just white tea, they call it. That's actually just water because they can't afford to give you anything more than water, but they call it white tea. So, you know, protein, nutrient sources are relatively few. So, you know, there are lots of people in the world who don't have a lot of money. So meat is not, you know, we'll take it where it comes. So let's just remember where we are coming from and, you know, not say, oh my God, they eat dogs, they're the worst people in the world.
Yeah, I think one thing, though, that was kind of an interesting issue with this story was that I think that, you know, I think, you know, regardless of whether, you know, whether the people involved in the story were for or against eating dog, this restaurant didn't even sell dog. And that, you know, was just based on the stereotype of, you know, of someone making an assumption based on someone's accent. And that I think that, you know, I think this is an example of, you know, say if this wasn't a Chinese restaurant, say if it was, you know, an Ethiopian restaurant, and would the person have just taken the person's word for it that had just picked up the phone, or would the person have tried to talk to the business owner or a manager at the restaurant? Would the person have actually tried to go to New York and buy the item and tasted it to see if it was some kind of mystery meat, or, you know, or if it was dog itself?
If anyone has any questions, just let me know, raise your hand, and we'll call on you.
I think one of the things about this story that's so fascinating is that, you know, along the food chain, there are gatekeepers, you know, and this keeps on just kind of going past the gatekeepers because, of course, you know, as Mei was saying, you know, we are a culture of dog lovers, right? You know, we have dogs as pets, and so the idea, you know, we quickly pass judgment as like these terrible people that are eating dogs, oh no, but, you know, what do you need to have, you know, in that food chain to where there's a gatekeeper somewhere as this is going through fact check after fact check where it stops?
Yes, question.
Yeah, I also think that it's important to note that to be culturally sensitive, because if it was that's why it's important to have, say, Asian Americans, or if it was a Chinese American that did the story, they would see that there was an accent and they would understand that, you know, there's a language barrier, you know, and that person over on the other side of the phone might not have been able to speak English very well. So that's why he said duck, you know, said duck, that sounded like dog. Right. So I think that, you know, it's important to note that there are language barriers when it comes to covering these communities, these Asian communities, and also the importance of being culturally sensitive.
Speaking of language issues, now I want to just ask this, and thanks for raising that point. You know, I want to ask Henry about this because I was I took a group of Chinese, you know, newsmakers around the LA Times building, and Daryl, who's, you know, the very famous tour guide, gave a tour of the beautiful tour. And I remember I asked him, I said, do you have any Chinese speakers on your staff? He said, one, and that was Ching Ching Ni. But Ching Ching's no longer with the LA Times. So I'm just sort of curious about what LA Times' commitment is to getting more native speakers on their staff.
I think there are more, and they may not always be Asian Americans. A lot of our staff have studied in China, or that was a popular choice of language to to study, just as when I was in college many moons ago in a different century. Japanese was a popular topic. So I don't have a list per se, but when, in our internal email, when someone has a language, a translation problem, the message is that who can speak, fill in the blank. And every time we've done that, someone's done that, a person has raised his or her hand. So Ching Ching is unfortunately no longer with the staff, but there are others, certainly those who work in China right now, and there are people in the building. In fact, our film editor, I think, no, let's see, she speaks Japanese. There's some people elsewhere on the staff who do it. So we don't have that issue. But we have to make diversity one of the factors in how we hire. And I'll just say, without casting aspersions, through the multiple changes of administration since I've been there in 23 years, some editors have placed more importance on it than others, and it shows in the waxing and waning of the staff. We do have a diversity program called MetPro, through whose auspices I became a journalist at a very advanced age. I was in my 30s when I became a journalist and editor, thanks to that program. So our staff is not reflective of the wider community. I'm happy to say that because I can count on my friends on the staff. Our staff is about 10% API, which is roughly what LA County is. I wish I could say that about every population within the county. So I take it seriously in how I hire. Our current editor does. We've got a long way to go, but we do try to apply the right folks to the stories when cultural awareness is really an issue. I don't want to sound too defensive, but I wonder if I could segue to the idea that how we cover things day to day. We're surrounded by stereotypes and misconceptions. There's the sort of disaster level talk of the industry, stupid coverage that we saw. I mean, 2 stories about dog eating in one lifetime was too many within the mainstream American media. But as we were talking ahead of time on this panel, I thought the thing I look at is that every day, not every day, but every so often we come across just sort of the random, seemingly colorful, pardon the pun, reference to someone's cultural identity. There was a big story in the last week. I'll try to be generic here so I don't embarrass people by name, but it's a big story in which it was one of those classic stories where an event happened. And so the way you described the event is you talked to lots of people in a particular city. And so we quoted lots of people. And 2 of the folks that were just everyday folks that were asked to comment on this story, one was described as a Lebanese immigrant, one was described as a person of Armenian descent. There was no racial, ethnic, cultural component to the story. It was just seen as a fact about the speakers. So all we knew about these 2 men was something about their cultural background and their names and their comments on the issue of the day. This went, there were 3 bylines, there were a couple other reporters, so I don't think all 5 of them had a say in writing that, but there were 3 or 4 layers of writing and editing, and I happened to spot this, and so I had to ask that those references be removed because they weren't germane, and they had the effect of sort of saying this is important about this person when it really wasn't in this context, and so that kind of thing connotes a person's otherness then in a way that is not instructive. It's just sort of empty calories. It's just a fact that upon which a reader could say, oh, that must be important because the LA Times said so, and it's important because, and then you can fill in your own cultural interpretation of that. So I worry about, this is embarrassing to the industry and really bad, but so bad and so atrocious, I think most of us can recognize it as such. What happened in those 2 newsrooms is unknown. But it's the everyday sort of floating in the ether stuff that we're surrounded by that can often get in print. If those things had been printed, would anyone have been the worse off for it? I mean, many readers may have read over it. Many of my colleagues did. But it was important for me to tell the folks involved that that's the kind of thing that you have to watch out for. It sounds interesting and possibly useful, but in the end, had no meaning. And so that's the kind of thing I worry about that is maybe more subtle. And having maybe my background sort of sensitizes that to me. I've witnessed very few, as I said to the group earlier, jaw-dropping instances of stereotyping. I won't bore you now, but early in my career I came across just a terrible incident, and it still shakes me up when I think about it. But it was very rare. Usually we have a very thoughtful approach to covering our communities, but it helps that our staff is more diverse than certainly was 30 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago. Never enough, and you have to have sensitivity at each level. And the question you asked earlier was that somewhere, where were the gatekeepers? And something failed at every step, and it could have been it must have been, well, certainly a lack of good judgment, but perhaps not a sufficient level of cultural awareness generally at each of those steps. And it's easy to talk about it after the fact, but there were so many clues in front in these two stories to the folks who published it that it was wrong and should have been stopped, yet they missed them because they could see a quote-unquote good story and it fit their preconceived notion of the folks being described. And that's the unfortunate thing that happens.
Right. I mean, totally building on this, one really good point that Henry just brought up is, Henry is neither of Palestinian or Armenian descent, but just the fact that you are of some sort of immigrant descent. You have that sensitivity that let you catch that, where somebody else may not have caught that. And the same thing goes with the language issue that Amy just brought up. I mean, you see, this reporter, he's just on the phone, you sure, it's dog, and he's in Midwestern English, and of course somebody is responding in accented English saying duck. If there were that sensitivity, and he may not have been a Mandarin or Cantonese speaker, or the language of the person on the phone, but even if he were a Spanish speaker, even if he were just sort of aware of the fact that, sometimes a word sounds like a different word, and it's just familiar enough with it, that might be enough to help somewhere along the way, somewhere along the line, that kind of sensitivity somewhere in the organization, which, I'm just keep on making my case for diversity in the newsroom, but, yeah.
Yes, comment.
My comment, or my question is mostly for Mei. Is it Mei?
Yeah.
But I think I'd like to hear everyone's opinion on this. I'm glad that this story turned out to be a load of BS. I mean, because it really does anger me to see stories that are born out of stereotypes. However, I mean, I've lived in Thailand, and you and I both know, we all know that they do eat dog in some regions. I have a dog I rescued from a dog meat trade area. I don't culturally have a problem with it, but it happens, and it gets reported on in the news all the time. When you have stories like that, a case that might be viewed negatively on, say, the American side of the spectrum, or something that might cause concern with cultural sensitivity towards the Asian side of the spectrum, how do you balance good reporting and reporting the truth while remaining culturally sensitive and trying to avoid perpetuating the stereotypes? Because as soon as Americans see a story like that, there's been a lot about the Chinese dog meat trade recently.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as they see that story, they're going to just go, "Ha, Chinese people all eat dogs."
There's a certain element of juicy, what makes a juicy story, right? Something like that's going to jump out at you. I think the answer to that is a certain amount of nuance. You kind of want to tell a good story. That's why we all become journalists, so we can tell, can you believe this, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, there are ways that you can make it a very strong argument, but at the same time, sort of nuance it a little bit. And yes, this is the joke, is standing joke for all the China correspondents who come to China is that, somebody's always going to write a story about somebody eating something weird. So, the joke was always, all right, they're going to go down to, there's a famous street in Beijing where they show all the scorpions and the starfish all being grilled, and everybody wants to do a story on that. So and then, or about eating rats or something like that. And yeah, there's a certain element of otherness. You are not writing, if you're a foreign correspondent writing that story, you have to also remember who your audience are. So you're not writing for the Chinese people, you're writing for your American audience. So there's a certain element of, yes, I'm going to tell you something that's different about them, but I'm also going to tell you something that's same about them or something. So you want to balance stories. So there's no great answer for it. I'm sure in my time I've done some stories which might have seemed culturally biased in some sense. But you try and I'll give you an example. One of the stories I did before the startup of the Beijing Olympics was a story about how Beijing was removing all the badly mistranslated English signs. And that's something that people used to love to go, you go and take a picture, and it's something very mistranslated, there was a big hospital, a proctology hospital, I suppose, and it was called the Dongda Hospital. And the big sign used to say Dongda Anus and Intestine Hospital. And so, anybody who's English speaker would be like, Well, because you don't see the word anus come up and slap you in the head like that, you know. So, so you're like, ooh, and of course, yeah, I gotta write that story, you know, when they're removing that sign. But at the same time, you wanted to be culturally sensitive. So I wrote about the fact that they were removing all this hilarious signs, but I also tried to get different viewpoints. So I had the viewpoints of the foreigners that said, oh man, I'm going to miss these kind of signs. These are the things that make China feel special and interesting. But I also got some viewpoints there from Chinese people who said, you know what, it's time these signs go. We are tired of being laughed at. We don't think it's funny at all. And so I tried to get that in there. I mean, to me, there was a definite hyok factor in it that I wanted to keep. But at the same time, wanted to reflect the fact that for Chinese, you know, the Beijing Olympics, where they were going to get so many cameras, so many visitors looking at them, this was their moment to shine and show themselves as a growing superpower, and they were just tired of being the people making all these bad jokes and dog-eating jokes. They wanted to have their moment too. So I tried to put that in there too, and I think it made for a more interesting story than it was just for, they're going to take all those away. So that's my little example.
I think journalism with such obvious rubbernecking and gawkery is just not good journalism to me. You know, so if it's in the public interest and there are dogs, you know, they are being consumed in China, but if they're being raised under the same conditions as pigs and beef and all these other things, then what is the big expose here? Maybe there is no expose, but when it becomes this kind of like gawking and trying to define a whole culture by what they eat once in a while, in a long while, then I think that's where it becomes an issue.
I mean, you can't lose your sense of humor, your awe about being in a different culture, because those things inform your story and make it interesting. But you also can't be too didactic. But at the same time, you want to be knowledgeable and infuse it with something beyond just saying, "Whoa, look at them! They're weird. They're strange." You know. So I guess that's my answer.
I think part of for me, part of the problem I'm seeing with this particular case, because, well, with the dog meat, we do see that coming up over and over and over again. You know, from my point of view, part of the problem is that most of the stories getting reported are the ones where we see dogs being kidnapped out of backyards and illegally exported, rather than seeing, okay, well, yes, this happens, however, blah, 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 cultural reasons, you know, really
I mean, yeah, there is a definite different background. I mean, America has a lot of laws against governing, abuse of animals. China has almost no such laws, and I've talked to people who are trying to create those laws, and it hasn't really happened yet. So that's that backdrop. There are very few, almost next to no animal. There's no SPCA, doesn't really exist there. There was a woman who ran a dog shelter in Beijing, and just one, and she had like something like 5,000 dogs in her compound. She said people just kept tossing the dogs over the fence, so that's like awareness that the kind of institutions that America has is because America is a wonderfully rich country in comparison to the rest of the world. And I mean, there's a joke, I think in Chinese, there's a saying, if you're going to be handicapped or you're going to be a dog, you should be an American because that's the best life for you.
I had a question too, actually, just you're talking about rubbernecking at, culturally very extreme stories. And I used to be a reporter for the Detroit News back in the early 90s, and there was a thing with the Gannett newspaper, and I wanted to ask this question. It was called mainstream, and as a reporter, we were told if you're covering a hockey game or the Apple Store's introducing the new iPhone, you must have at least one quote from a minority, African American, Latino, Asian American, and because they were trying to make more inclusive reporting where it doesn't have to be a story about dog eating or whatever, or it doesn't have to be a story about Asian American who's been a racist event or anything like that, or crossing the border for Latinos or whatever the stories that we're used to hearing about. And it'd be nice to have, oh, here's a Latino person that I interviewed about a Red Wings game, or oh, I talked to an African American about the new iPhone or whatever. And I was wondering if that's something that's still happening, because that was a big thing at Gannett, and I was wondering in the media if there's anything about that as well, because that seems to me as a way of a lot of people at the news, people complain about, oh, I have to go mainstream and find my mainstream quote. But looking back at that, it almost seems it was prescient, because now we're running into these same stories as opposed to just covering people for the sake of being people, and that we have more than just, we don't always want to be quoted in stories
Are they daily reporters here?
I'll go. I know that Henry probably has something to say about this too, right? But we have these conversations. We do. Now, it's not, that's very different. You're talking about actual quotas, like go make sure that you get one person. I mean, on my beat, of course, with my editors, we have these conversations. One of the conversations that we've had is, let's talk to people who aren't necessarily Latino, because it's not just a Latino issue. But I do cover immigration, so that sort of, of course, immigrants, race, that's part of what we talk about every day. I can't really tell you what goes on with other beats, but it is something that, it becomes, you try to make it second nature, so that you're actually just sort of like reaching out to, other people that you don't, may not think of, doing the dial quote with when you're doing that daily. So that is part of the conversation. But there was something else that somebody mentioned here earlier, that you talk about like the idea of, I know what it was. Does anybody familiar with the Race Card Project? Michelle Norris is doing it. Okay, she was actually part of an NPR story the other day that was covering the project. But a couple of people who have actually responded and written their little 6-word essays. And just to explain for those who haven't heard of it, it's this project where people are invited to send in 6 words, just 6 words on race, on their experience with race, a 6-word essay. And there's an Ernest Hemingway historical reason for this, but I won't get into it. Anyway, so people have written these very poignant things in 6 words. And one woman who was part of the story explained, ask who I am, not what. And she talked about, she was Korean American from Seattle. She's from Seattle. She's not, probably think she's 3rd generation or something like that. And people would always ask, but I'm from Seattle. Well, where are you really from? The what are you really from question. And the way she described it is that, people want to know what my otherness is so that they can actually like fit me into that otherness box that they have. Oh, she's Korean. Okay, let's just like throw everything that we know about Koreans into that box and now we can identify her. And that's something that, when you're talking about, is it really germane to the story to say whether that person is of Armenian descent? No, it's really not. Then, maybe no harm would have really come from it, but at the same time, what box do you start putting that person into? What sort of otherness, sort of qualities do you begin to imbue them with? So, yeah, these are conversations that we have in newsrooms, maybe they're a little bit more nuanced than, make sure you get a person of X descent, but they still happen.
I'm not aware of. I've never been part of that conversation. I've only worked in New York and LA, so very diverse markets. But I know that was a kind of a thing for a while. I have sort of mixed feelings. I mean, you're picking a person and you're putting her in a box, and that has a lot of problems with it. On the other hand, there's certain people who don't appear in sort of non-ethnic based stories, and so you want to broaden the folks you talk to, but you don't do it through a formula. I think it sends the bad message to the staff, like this is an obligation, and you're not going to say in the story, it said so-and-so an African American, but it just, there's all kinds of hidden messages there that I think are mostly negative. The way you do it is you walk a little farther on your beat. I love how Wendy covers business at KPCC. I mean, her story choices are very diverse, whether that's by design or that's you. I don't know what your mandate is, but I hear all kinds of great stuff just that covers LA in a really interesting way. It reflects LA. I think one of the best descriptions I heard, this is in the realm of how we're getting everything so digital now, and an editor recommended it to some students. I was on a panel right next to me. He said, make your job bigger. So I would say make your beat bigger, and that is try to go that extra block or find a different neighborhood, and you'll more organically, to use a kind of a cliched word, find people who will speak to the subject, not because you're trying to hit a formula, but because they'll have a perspective that you may lack personally or from the other folks you've spoken to. That's the way you do it, I would say. Yeah. And it's a chance for me to compliment my friend Wendy. I just love what you're doing there.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Wendy?
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, I used to work at Gannett Paper, so I am familiar with the mainstreaming thing, but I agree with Henry. I think that, I don't think that people should be given quotas. I think that people should, just go out into the communities and challenge themselves. Try to talk to, as many people as you can. That if there's a certain issue going into a community, talk to the people there. If your story is about a certain topic impacting a certain, immigrant group, go talk to that group. I think that for me as a business reporter, I've never received a mandate in terms of what types of people I need to talk to. I mean, I have some general topic areas, like I cover retail and agriculture and and sometimes airlines. But, outside of those topics, there's nothing else that really limits me in terms of who I talk to or how I go about trying to find the information. So I just try to get out into the community as much as I can.
I think that intent behind that policy of mainstreaming was a good one, but I think the formulas makes for bad reporting because then you're going to end up reporting formulaic stories. I think the intent was that, yes, get multiple voices so you get a more nuanced view, but sometimes it's a judgment call. Maybe you don't need to go and check off these 3 boxes for that particular story. And what brings me to mind is there was a Pew Research study, I think, was it a year ago? It talked about Asian Americans being the model minority. Anybody remember that one? And and they said, well, they tend to be more highly educated, higher percentage of college degrees, and there was a lot of blowback about that because people challenged that. Especially I think scholars, because they say when you crunch down the numbers, that's not necessarily true. What do you mean by Asian American? For example, the dropout rate among Southeast Asians is one of the highest. So so if you actually crunch down, you can really break it down many ways, right? So just because you're ticking off a box and you're going to talk to someone who's African American doesn't mean she represents the whole African American culture. So it's a judgment call. Yes, diversity is good. More voices may lend something to the story. Being thoughtful about things. Checking out the boxes, I don't like that, and I guess nobody else seems to either.
I think, I think probably back then, and this I won't date you by saying how long ago this might have been, but I mean, this is a way to sort of get the conversation going to where maybe now it's hopefully second nature to some reporters to if you're doing a story on demographics, don't just go to freaking Boyle Heights, go to Cerritos, go somewhere else. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, it's a floor, not a ceiling, right? It's just to get the level up. Thanks so much to our panelists, and thanks to the audience for good questions. Thank you. And we have to get our next speaker in here, so I'll let these folks come in here. So if you have any questions, feel free to come up to our folks and grab them.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Great job. It's an honor to be next to you.
It's an honor to be next to you.
It's me.
Oh, thank you.
Don't let the fancy title fool you.
I'm all out of cards, but I'll send you emails just so we can finish this time. Now, I'm curious, did you wind up getting your last name the way that I got my last name?
I'm a Japanese American and an immigrant. My mom was Japanese, became a citizen much later here in the States, and my dad was an American serviceman.
Okay.
So I was born in Japan and was there for like 9 months.